My name is Asia Sampson, and if you are watching this video right now, then that means my little DIY experiment actually worked. Oh, but wait, what if it didn't work though? I should do an intro just in case this whole thing fell apart, yeah? Yeah. My name is Asia Sampson, and technically, this video doesn't even exist. Ooh, that's trippy. Now, one constant, really big need of mine, and probably a big need for many of you, especially if you have a family and you have kids, is table space. We can't seem to have enough table space. It seems like we're always running out of room. I have tried to remedy that situation a couple of different ways. I have a pull-out drawer that has a flat surface on top that I can rest stuff on. It has a pull-out cutting board. Now I have a drop-down tailgate table, but it's still just never enough. I mean, I can go get a table. You can go to Walmart right now and buy one of those humongous tables that just flop open, that have the legs that pull out, and that has enough space for you to put a lot of your stuff. But I just don't want another humongous table like that I have to store in my cargo area, especially when I'm trying to pare down gear and not have such bulky stuff back there. So I started thinking about different options, and one of the things I was thinking about was, how can I store a table on my roof rack without it taking up any more real estate of my roof rack? What if I could fashion something where I could just slide a table and sandwich it between the roof of my vehicle and the bottom of my roof rack, because there is a huge gap there and that's space that's not even being used. I've actually been thinking about this DIY project for a while now, and it's been ruminating in my head how I'm going to do it. But you know what? This week, we're just going to go for it and see if it works. Now, I really wouldn't consider this idea to be original. In fact, the only reason why I have this idea is because FrontRunner already sells a full kit of this exact same thing. It's basically a rail system that fits underneath their roof racks. You slide your table into there, lock it, and now you have a place to store your table without taking up space in your cargo area. The only problem is their kit with the table and the rail system is $700, and that's pretty steep for me, considering that I could buy a regular dining table for my house for about $700. So today we're going to see if I can actually do this for a lot cheaper and do it myself. So this is basically everything in a nutshell. We have our table. It's 2 feet by 4 feet, half-inch birch plywood. I really like the surface of this. I'm going to spray it with truck bed coating. This one is by Raptor. I'm probably going to lacquer the table, maybe just to make sure it's watertight, and then spray this on top of that just to give it even more protection from the weather. Now, after I have the table weather sealed and prepared the way I'd like, I'm going to line the entire edge of the table with one of these. It's an aluminum U-channel, and this will just help protect the edges of the table from nicks and scratches and dings and that type of thing. Lining the edges of this table will also make it easier to slide in and out of the rail. Here is the rail right here, and you'll see that it's slightly bigger than the other one. This is what gets attached to the bottom of the roof rack. And then once the table is built, it just goes in here real nicely, and you'll be able to kind of... But if all that sounds confusing to you, don't worry. I'm going to walk you step by step through it, show you exactly what I've been envisioning in my head. So yeah, let's just get started. All right, so here's the plan. The plan is to put this table storage system in the back. That way I slide the table into the back, pull it out from the back. Would have been nice to have it coming out from the sides, but unfortunately, the way FrontRunner has their roof rack setups, there is a bracket that runs the entire length of the rack, so it prevents you from having any access to the bottom of the rack from the sides. So we're gonna go ahead and put it in the back area. I've already relocated the chase light. The chase light used to sit in that crevice between the roof and the roof rack, and so there was no access to the bottom of the rack from there either. But moving it to the top over where my rooftop tent is, I now have full access to the bottom of the rack from here, and now I can start storing things in between the rack and my roof. So hopefully it'll work out. Should look really good if it does. So let's just get started. The rails are finished, painted, ready to be installed, but before I do, let me just kind of walk you through it, show you what I've done. That way, everything that you just saw me do, it'll make a lot more sense. Believe it or not, this is actually version 2. Version 1 did not work out the way I thought it would. And the way I had version 1 was I had these 2 individual rails that were mounted to the bottom of the roof rack. And the issue I started running into was the fact that because they're individually mounted, trying to get them to be 90 degrees to the rack itself, or even having them be evenly spaced out all the way through the whole length, was proving to be really difficult because it would sometimes be kind of off like this. So every time I pulled out the table, it didn't come out straight. It would come out like at an angle, or the front would be closer than the rears, or the rears would be closer than the front. So every time I try to slide a table in there, it would just get hung up, or parts of it would just fall, and it was getting really, really difficult. Not only that, I made these to be the exact same length of the table I was sliding underneath. So sometimes, whenever I would mount this, I would tighten the ends, but then it would end up bowing out like this. And again, because it's the whole length of the table, it was getting really hard to slide the table in there without it getting hung up somewhere along the rails. So enter Mark II. Same concept as before. Basically, you have your 2 channels. You have one on this side, you have one on the other side, and the table will just slide in between them. The only difference is this time, I actually used the table along with the edging that I'm going to put on it to determine how far apart I needed to make these 2 rails. And then I took some crossbars, one at the top, one at the bottom, so that I can ensure that the 2 rails are evenly spaced from each other. So now when I put this underneath the roof rack, the front is not going to be closer than the rears, or the rears are going to be closer than the front. Both rails stay evenly spaced out throughout the entire thing. You'll also notice that these rails are much shorter than the original ones that I made. The original ones spanned the entire length of the table, 48 inches. And again, every time I tried to mount that underneath the roof rack, it would bow out in the middle somewhere, which made it difficult to slide a table through. These are only 27 inches, which means that the likelihood of this bowing out somewhere in the middle were a lot less likely. You don't really need to span the entire table with a rail. You just need a long enough rail to hold that table in place securely. And with this being 27 inches and the table being 48, this is way more than half, so it will hold that table nice and securely. I just have to make sure that there's a stop at the end so that when I slide the table through, it will stop and then lock it up in the front somehow, and then this is not gonna move at all. Now earlier you saw me hold up these rails to underneath the roof rack and do some markings. That just told me what length I needed this to go from the edge of one rail to the edge of another, and then I made a couple more other marks, and these marks correspond to where the channels are underneath those rails. And then I took the crossbars here and then I marked out the middle, so now I know anywhere along this line lines up with the channels that are underneath the roof rack. And that's really important because on each end, you'll see that I have these two holes, one on each side. This is what's gonna hold this rail system underneath the roof rack. I'm basically taking an M8 bolt similar to this, and this will slide into the channel of the roof rack and then come into this hole here, and then we lock it down, and that's what's gonna hold this in place. Now this is why having these lines on these crossbars are very, very important. Remember what I said earlier, that these lines correspond to the channel that's underneath my roof rack. Well, to attach the crossbars to the rails, I needed to bolt them on both sides. Bolting them in, you're gonna end up having like a nut and washer protruding from each side. And if they don't correspond to the channel that's underneath the roof rack, well, the rack itself is going to prevent this from sitting flush. But because these lines correspond to those channels, anything that's protruding along those lines, as long as it's thinner than the actual channel itself, will just fall in between those channels. But attaching these brackets and these crossbars to these rails presents another problem. We have to attach it with nuts and bolts. Well, the head of those bolts are now taking up space inside this already tight channel. Remember, the table along with the edging slides nicely in these channels. Well, if you have bolt heads in here, that's gonna take up some space for that table to slide right through. Something's gonna get hung up. Over here, you'll see that the bolts that I used to hold the brackets in place are rounded out. You don't wanna use like the square kind of bolt heads, because once you slide that table in, that table is just gonna get hung up on those bolt heads. Well, these are rounded, so the table will kind of just slide right through it. This, however, presented another problem. To attach the crossbars to this rail, that bolt head was so thick that I couldn't even slide it through, because the edging for that table pretty much takes up this entire length. I only have like maybe an eighth, or just a little bit more than an eighth of clearance. So what I ended up doing was, after I installed this crossbar to the rails, I used an angle grinder and grinded down the bolt head, and now it clears perfectly. So I thinned out that bolt head, makes it a lot easier. Now as far as painting this thing, I only painted the areas you're going to see. Once this gets mounted to underneath the roof rack, you're really only going to see the sides and maybe the bottom, if that. I didn't paint the top because once this gets mounted, you're not even gonna see the top. I didn't paint the crossbars because once the table is in place, you're not going to see that either. But more importantly, I didn't paint the inside channel because I didn't want any kind of textured rough paint inside to hinder the slide of that table. I wanted it to be as smooth as possible. Now, I don't know how much of this you can actually see, but this is why I really like the Raptor truck bed coating. The finish this thing leaves behind just looks so good and professional. The texture is amazing, and it's all coming from just a spray can. But anyway, I've done enough talking. Honestly, I'm just stalling. When I did the install of the first versions, it was just such a pain in the butt trying to maneuver these brackets underneath the roof rack and getting my hands in there to tighten the bolts. But we got to do what we got to do. Let's just get this thing mounted. Alright, so back to make another modification. As it turns out, these nuts here are actually too thick for the channel. The channel is actually not wide at all. It's pretty thin, and this won't fit in between that channel. So what I'm going to have to do is take these bars and just move it so that it'll fall between the roof rack slats. So that way there's nothing that is above it that will hinder this from sitting flat. So I'm just gonna have to move this over here, move this over here a little bit, and that should solve it, but I should have saw that coming. So it's been fixed. I placed the crossbars out a little bit more, so now the slats of the roof rack, one will be over here, there's another slat that goes over here, and it's basically empty in the middle, so there should be nothing that this will get hung up on. All right, so I finally have the rails installed, and let me tell you, this way was way easier than the first time I did it. Having those crossbars really helped in making sure that both rails stay parallel with one another and they're not getting skewed and they're not bending, and it helped keep the structure of it intact. But what we do have to do before I test it out to see if the table will fit is on the last channel, the last slat that I have on my roof rack, we're gonna put another one of these M8 bolts, and what this is really going to do is act as a stop. So this will be on the final slat of my roof rack, and so when the table comes sliding through, it'll stop at this bolt and it won't keep going forward. I might need a longer one though. I'm not sure if this is going to be long enough, but that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to test it out and see if this can work as a good stop at the very end. Do you want to know why this is a two-part video series? Because I knew there was no way in hell that I was going to finish this project in just 1 week in order for me to release this week's video. Not only that, there's a lot of explanation that I have to do in how I built this thing that if I were to add the table build on top of that as well, then you're probably looking at a 60-minute video, and I don't want to hold you hostage any longer than I already have. See, the thing about doing DIYs to come straight out of your imagination without any point of reference to anybody else who's done the same kind of DIY is that I knew I was going to run into a bunch of different issues that I could have possibly never seen coming. I mean, I made 2 versions of this thing, you guys. I mean, when I've been thinking about this in my head and planning it all out, I thought that first version is going to fly. Like, I thought it was going to work, it was going to be perfect, and no, but I think I got it now. Now I have something that actually holds its shape, and I'm able to slide that table smoothly, and it's working out great. Now, if you're still kind of confused about how I built this thing, well, just know that it's a little bit more complicated in this way because of the way we mount things to our roof racks. Front Runner, Rhino Rack, and I think ARB, a lot of these new roof racks, Prinsu, they use T-channel systems, which I love because you basically just take a bolt, you put it into the channel, slide it wherever you want along the rails of the roof rack, and then you can mount things to it. So I had to make this so that it lines up with those channels. However, if you're going to be building this for something else like a Gobi, you can pretty much put this wherever you want. The structure for this is not complicated at all, and I will try to explain it to you as simply as I possibly can. You're basically just taking U-channels like this, and you are putting them underneath your roof rack, and you're allowing a table to slide in between these channels. How far apart these channels are entirely up to you, however big you want your table to be. I'm doing a 2 by 4 feet table, so they're about 2 feet apart. And all we do there is we add crossbars to these so that it retains their perpendicularity. Is that even a word? It's really just so that these rails stay even all the way throughout so that when you're sliding your table, it's not off. Once you have that square structure pretty much set, you just have to mount it to the bottom of your roof rack however you want to do it. That's all you're really doing. You're basically just taking 2 channels like this, putting some crossbars so that it retains the shape and the structure, and then mounting it however you want. But that's pretty much part 1, building out the rails and getting a system in place and mounting it to the bottom of the roof rack. Now that that's there, we can move on to part two, which is actually building out the table itself. That shouldn't be as complicated as what we had to deal with today. Hopefully you stick around, and I hope this video was helpful for you, and maybe it gave you some ideas on how to build one for yourself. If you did find this helpful, if you liked it, please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and also consider supporting us on Patreon so we can continue to make more content like this. And as always, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Baptism Overland. My name is Asia Sampson, and I will see you next time. God, do you know how difficult you made my life, man? Jeez.